Welcome to Start Now, a conversational podcast which discusses topical issues designed to get people to think about the challenges occurring in the world around us and how each of us can be a part of positive, transformative change. Start Now is meant to be informative and engaging while encouraging and motivating people to start where they are and with the resources they have to make a difference in their communities and in the worlds around them. Let's start now. Hey everybody, welcome to Start Now. We are so excited that you have joined us for today's conversation. In our episode today, we are going to be looking at trauma, what it is, and how do we begin to heal as a start to being able to really live our best life. But first, introductions. I am your host, Armani Ray, and today with our guest, we have joining us Miss Zoe Seegers, a licensed mental health counselor with Ray of Hope Counseling. We also have Dr. Cicely with us with psychotherapy and empowerment. And then we have Miss Brandy Durham, JD, mother, actress, everything phenomenal and extraordinaire, and CEO of Durham Legal Services. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. And I think I think Kennedy is mad I didn't introduce her. Kennedy, thank you for joining us as well. Miss Kennedy. And I just want all of our listeners and viewers to know this is a count and a testament that as a woman, you can do anything, be a mother, and still be awesome. So again, we are so excited. Yes, women power, that you all are here today. So thank you again. So let's jump right in. We know that mental health in our nation is a big deal. So according to the National Institute for Mental Health, 1 in 5 Americans suffers from some form of mental illness. So when we look at those statistics and we look at the rate of individuals who are seeking help and treatment for anxiety and depression, we look at the youth and how mental health among our youth is worsening. What are some things that cause trauma? What is trauma and what does that mean? Dr. Cicely, we'll start with you.
Ooh, what is trauma? It's somewhat of a loaded question, but at its core, trauma is just anything that can cause a distressing response in the individual. And, so often we think of our military folks who've seen active combat. Yes, that certainly is trauma, but trauma can also be verbal in nature. It can be chronic verbal abuse that happens in the home. It can be physical for sure. It can be spankings that go way beyond anything that should ever be used or referred to as discipline. It can be slaps. It can be pushing. Trauma can also be neglect. It can be without having needs met, emotional needs, physical, medical needs. All of those can be seen as trauma. It can happen to trauma. Trauma can happen and be experienced even by babies who are still in the womb. So any of the things that I just mentioned, and I'm sure that is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but yeah, anything that can cause distress in an individual it can be considered as trauma.
And I think it's interesting too, because when you say the word trauma, some people look at it in its most severe sense of the word and they think, well, trauma is just like getting into like a major car accident and sustaining major injuries. And some people will be like, oh no, trauma is when I get my hair cut and colored the wrong way, and so I think you have those different levels. So can all of that stuff, what is that spectrum, Zoe?
Well, I think trauma has kind of been thrown around a lot in society, and people talk about being traumatized by their hair being cut too short or by breaking a nail or something like that. Like I might have said one time or two that I was traumatized by like a giant cockroach or something, but trauma in and of itself is not something, mild or moderate like that. Trauma is more so when the very fiber of your being is threatened, like your safety, your life, is in danger or threatened. And one other type of trauma that I wanted to bring up, that in addition to what you mentioned, Cicely, is vicarious trauma. And they talked a lot about that with especially with September 11th, and a lot of therapists offering counseling services and counseling people who were there at the forefront and witnessed a lot of really traumatic things, and processing that with a lot of therapists, and therapists after that reporting being traumatized vicariously, having to process those really traumatic events with those people. And so sometimes you're not even there to experience it yourself, but having to be exposed to it with processing it with someone else can be traumatizing. So it does come in many forms and shapes, but it's more about, like having to deal with something very threatening, very dangerous, very, extreme fight or flight type thing.
Okay, and I think that actually is a great segue into our next question on what are some misconceptions people have about trauma, because honestly, I didn't even realize about vicarious trauma. So, I think that was brilliant to be able to, inform viewers and listeners about that. So what are some other misconceptions about it?
Misconceptions about trauma?
Yeah, like, are there certain misconceptions like, oh, well, women experience it more, or, men don't experience it at all? Like, so what are some things that people think, only this particular person can be traumatized? You can only be traumatized, if you've been, like Cicely was saying, like in a war or a victim of abuse.
Yeah, well, I think it is very individualized. I mean, again, so it can be like really upsetting, of course, like if your hair is cut too short, or if you find a giant roach waiting for you in your bathroom or something. That can be very, like, you describe it as traumatic, but like, is your life in danger? No. And so, but it is very individualized. And someone gave the example of like there were two women, and one had been like outright sexually assaulted, and another had been maybe groped in a crowd or on a bus or something like that. And the one that had been groped was very, described the event as very traumatic for her. She was very afraid. Maybe she was in a public place, couldn't get to safety. Maybe she felt trapped in that situation, and maybe like developed agoraphobia because of it, and couldn't go out by herself anymore. And it was very, very traumatic. And the other lady who was, sexually assaulted, and it was like an acquaintance, maybe like a date rape or something like that. And she was upset about it, but she didn't describe it as traumatic. And so it is very, individualized that way. Like, just because you are sexually assaulted doesn't mean you'll describe feeling traumatized. Just because you were, deployed, to a war zone doesn't mean you will be traumatized. My dad was in Vietnam, and he was like the most calm, cool, collected person in the world. And I was like, how did you do that? He was like, it's just my nature.
Yeah,
So,
I actually was going to say, so if it's individual, like where is that resiliency factor? Almost like what makes one person be so, traumatized, though somebody can experience something truly traumatic and not feel those effects? I mean, is there any sort of repression? Are they putting it away somewhere, or is it just like how they're made up?
They do say there is a biological component, that some people are more susceptible to trauma, and they're like, based on how their limbic system is, and like their fight or flight response. And some people are more subject to feeling traumatized than others, and it is like a biological thing. But I don't think that they've like pinpointed it. I don't think that they can say, okay, yes, you will be traumatized. No, you won't be. They can't differentiate that way.
And I think that's really interesting too, because do you also feel that it could be situational? And so an example would be last summer, I was overseas and my phone was stolen in Spain. I was getting off the metro and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I got my phone close to me, this, that, whatever. Pickpockets obviously are brilliant. Still ended up getting my phone. And I felt it come out, but all of a sudden there was this rush of people, of course, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I lost my phone. Like, I was traumatized because I'm in this foreign country. I was with one other person, I don't have any way of getting in touch with somebody now. I literally was like about to have a breakdown, but then, it's like being in an abusive relationship with somebody who was mentally and verbally abusive and emotionally abusive. It's like, I was like, oh, okay, you're not going to treat me that way. I'm out. And so it's interesting, like your different reactions, I guess you could say. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback to what you said before they answer the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
From a legal standpoint, so if you, let's say a personal injury accident, right? Someone gets hurt. Well, 20 years ago, they had a broken arm or something when they were a kid. But then they get into this car accident and not only break the arm, but the bone shatters and something happens where whatever was hurt previously was made worse. So, you can, the person who's at fault can be liable for making worse something that had already happened. So how can that, I think that kind of ties into what Armani Ray said about bringing up something that, I don't know, that happened in the past could possibly, you know, is it trauma very subjective? Basically, it's not as objective as objective.
Yeah,
And
That's a good question. What do you
I
think,
would say that.
Cicely?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I agree 100% that there's a level of subjectivity when you talk about trauma, because we all are wired differently. And so, right, that there are certainly some biological markers. There's some, you know, heritability estimates that say if, you know, what you inherit from your parents, if you have, you know, a bloodline where there has been much more susceptibility, you are more likely to respond. But that also, you have to take into consideration that environmental exposure can also increase your likelihood to be traumatized in certain situations. So one person, you can have 4 people in a car and there's a car accident, you know, and it could be in, you know, factors like, where are you sitting in the car when the accident occurs? Have you been in an accident before? You know, did you maintain consciousness? You know, all of these different factors can then affect whether or not those 4 people all, you know, how they respond. And it's likely they'll have 4 different levels of types of response. And maybe one person will have a response that is, you know, that does reflect as trauma, where they have flashbacks, where they don't feel comfortable getting back into a car. Or if they do ride in a car, they have to sit in a particular seat. They can't sit, you know, where they were sitting when they were in the accident. So there are all kinds of responses and factors that contribute to those responses. So when you mention resiliency, that certainly can be a part of it. Some of us are just wired in such a way that we can go through something really catastrophic and walk away and, you know, kind of shake it off. But some of us will go through the same event and have the flashbacks, not be able to, you know, go near the space where it happened again. So that it is very, very individualized.
That's interesting. So what are your thoughts on it?
As far as
Well, you were,
situational versus.
yeah, you were speaking before.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, yeah, it is very, it's very subjective, is what I was going to say. Like people, you know, will kind of take things very differently, and it is like sometimes a nature nurture thing. If you witness your parents, you know, being their response, like how do they respond to things? Do they cope well? Do they freak out? Do they, you know, do you have a chance to develop coping skills? Do you, you know, what have you learned, and how do you learn to cope? And that'll have a bearing on like what you experience as trauma. So yeah, it's definitely very situational. And talking about your with your phone being stolen, so that was like probably very traumatic, because if you'd been like in, you know, at home, you know, in Florida, you wouldn't be freaking out. You'd be mad.
Right.
You probably try to chase him down or something, but you know, but you'd be easily.
No, me, I probably would. Give my phone back.
You could easily get another one, but you know, being in a foreign country, you don't speak the language, you don't know anybody, you're like stranded, even in a, you know, a fully populated city. So that could be I can see what that could be very, very traumatic. Whereas, you know, if you've been at home, it wouldn't be the same. You wouldn't have had the same type of feeling.
Right. Yeah, because it was like, you know, being in Spain and then having to get back and go to England because I still wasn't done, you know, with what I was doing, like the reason I was over there. So yeah, you know, and I was a mess. I was crying, girl. I was ugly crying too. Not even like the cute. So I think both Cicely and Zoe, you brought up very good points about the resiliency and the coping, and I want to get back to that. But because I also want to touch on the environmental factors that you were talking about, I kind of want to transition into that first. So COVID, pandemic, there is so much stress and anxiety going on. So we already know that, you know, people who have been seeking treatment for anxiety and depression, it has skyrocketed. You have social isolation going on, you know, because of the social distancing. So what are some things that people are experiencing now, and how can our environment play a role in the trauma that we experience?
So, take that one, yeah.
Well, it's kind of, again, kind of situational, because some people, I don't know if you probably have seen those memes where people talk about like they started when the pandemic started, or the social distancing or isolation or quarantining started, people were like, this is like my jam, like that. I feel like I've won the lottery. This is what I've been doing all along anyway. Why
It's
did everyone else do
introvert
it?
season. Yes, I was like, oh, I've already been doing this.
But then you have the flip side of that, where people are oh my gosh, like just not coping well, because like your life is like your life is the same essentially, but there's a very different component, and you can't just up and go where you want when you want. You can't spend time with friends and family. Now people talking about having virtual Thanksgiving and things like that, and there's been a huge increase in, you know, just like you said, anxiety and stress and anger, and people in my practice I've seen coming in saying like, you know, I'm angry, I'm upset, I can't sleep, I'm not, you know, and I just don't know why. And I've been calling it myself, I call it the pandemic syndrome, because, you know, that's what keeps happening. Like everybody is kind of at a loss and there's no end in sight. And even the vaccine that's coming is, no, everyone's not just, you know, gung-ho about taking that, you know, so there's no resolve. And it's very hard to hear about people, you know, passing away from from COVID, and even if it's somebody close to you or not, it's still like very jarring, because you don't know, like, am I next? Is my mom next? Is my loved one next? You know, and it's just, you don't have any way to cope because you don't have anything to compare it to. Everyone here today has never been through a pandemic before, and not like this anyway. And you know, you don't have a reference point. You can't. It's hard to cope. So everyone's kind of doing it the best way they can, but it's not. I don't know that it's providing the relief or like the resolve that people are really looking for.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because the pandemic has presented numerous challenges. It's not just losing loved ones, because obviously that's huge. That in and of itself will rock somebody's and shake their world. But it's also people who are becoming unemployed. Now they're stressed out because they don't know how they're going to feed their families. It's that stress because I don't have enough food to feed my families because I'm not working, you know, or because of impacts that are, you know, farmers are being felt and stuff like that. So I feel like it's just, you know, compounded and exacerbated, you know, in the sense because you're losing loved ones. And then heaven forbid if you lost a loved one and you lost your job, you know. So talk to us a little bit on how people can, you know, cope with things like that. I know that it's very difficult, you know, when Sister, you were saying earlier that some people just have this natural resiliency. What about people who don't have that natural resiliency? You know, how do we, you know, help ourselves, you know, cope if we don't have that reference point, like Zoe was saying? How do we begin to start to even be okay with what's going on, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the first steps that may seem like, well, duh, but it may not be easily accessible, is to be okay acknowledging what you're feeling. You know, so often especially when you're accustomed to providing for your family, when you're accustomed to having the job and, you know, being responsible, when those options are no longer present or when it's changed, you may feel like I just got to keep going. I've just got to keep pushing and those kinds of things. But that can actually make depression or anxiety and some other mental health challenges worse. It can put more stress, you know, tax your body, tax your immune system even more. So acknowledging that this is different, that it's scary, and that you need help. And that's one of the things that I think come out of this whole pandemic, is the notion that needing help is a weakness. You know, we now know that it absolutely is not. It's actually a strength when you both know that you need help and can seek out resources or support folks who can actually offer that help. People also, it's one of the things that's also happened is, again, connected with being employed and having, you know, all of these responsibilities that you fulfill, people are needing to kind of redefine themselves and realize that I am still a whole healthy person without having this job, without, you know, making a certain amount of money, without, you know, having these material or other tangible things to show. So it's kind of a two-sided coin, where people are having more time to sit at home and do some reflection and re-identify their strengths and develop some affirmations, which is always a good thing. But on the other side, where there's more time at home, where you are thinking, where you are reflecting, and that can also make people feel questionable or they have questions about decisions that they've made in the past. If I had done this, maybe I would not have done that. So talking it out loud with someone is always a good thing. All of the Zooming that people are doing, I know we hear all the jokes. I know some of us out. However, I'm telling you, it can be a lifeline. It can be a lifeline, and at a time when going out and being in person with people may not be an option. So
Yeah, and I think that's such a valuable point too, because I remember, and for our listeners and viewers, when I saw all my friends back on the screen, I just wanted to like hug my computer, you know? And so you don't realize how much you miss your friends until you see their faces, you hear their voices, how comforting that is, how much security that can provide you. And Cecily, you actually made a great point. I wanted to transition into Brandy and see, you know, what are some stresses that you are seeing, you know, some of your friends experiencing, what are maybe you experiencing, you know, because Brandy and I were talking earlier about our identities and about how sometimes people can use one thing to identify them, say, oh, I'm a mom. But wait, you're more than that. You know, you're a mom, you're an attorney, you're this, you're that, you know. And so how do we make sure, one, that we're still maintaining our own individual sense of who we are, even when we're feeling stressed, you know, but two, what are some things that you're seeing, you know, your friends experiencing, and how are you using that to help? So kind of like a two-part question.
Yeah, so with my friends, well, I can speak personally first. I know that I experienced a lot of anxiety at the beginning of COVID. We're talking about COVID, just because there were just so many unknowns. And I think my biggest issue was not being able to provide. I never lost my job. I actually, you know, money was not an issue the entire time for me. But when people were buying up all the toilet tissue and paper towels, and it was a frenzy, you know, I was like, what are they doing? And because in response to other people's actions, I started having a lot of anxiety, because I said, am I not going to be able to eat? And then, you know, people like me, I'm a big sci-fi person. So I grew up on the Walking Dead, you know, Doomsday, all of that.
So you were thinking everything.
The zombie apocalypse.
Like, if the power goes out, I need to make sure I have this and that. I mean, it was just the worst experience for me, because there was about a month where I was buying everything that I needed in case, you know, power went out, in case the food disappeared. I can't eat healthy. I don't necessarily eat out of cans, but I have canned food here now. I mean,
let me tell you, oh my gosh. So it was the same. So for our listeners and our viewers, everybody, all of our guests are from Florida. We don't all live in Florida now, but we're all, you know, from Florida. And so hurricane season is everything. We all know, like, if you're a real Floridian, if you get scared about hurricanes and you start like stocking up, like, wait, what category is this? Like, we don't freak out until it gets to be a certain category. But yes, Brandy, like all the toilet paper was gone. And I'm like, well, dang. Yeah, I'm not freaking out, but I need to get some toilet. I'm not about to be without no toilet paper.
Everyone's like, everyone else is buying toilet paper. I need toilet paper. And then like the napkins disappeared, and then the coffee filters disappeared.
right.
What are you using the coffee filters for exactly? But I'm like, I even started buying tissues in bulk. And I don't even buy tissues because I'm like, there was no toilet paper, there's no nothing. And so scared, and that can even cause more stress and anxiety.
Exactly. So after getting through that, and you know, I didn't want to become a person where, you know, I guess maybe the professionals could speak on this. Like, could this have manifested if I kept it going until me get a diagnosis of some sort of paranoia type thing, you know? Because there are people who use those aluminum foil hats and stuff. And I know in the law you deal with them too, you know, they always that somebody's watching them or something like that. And I was like, I gotta stop before I become one of those people, right? So I think once we got through the initial shock of everything, I can say that for the most part, many of my friends and myself included became very introspective because we had the time. And I'm always out. I'm an introvert, but I'm an extrovert. So I'm always out doing stuff, organized, something like that. To be in the house and just to be forced to be in the house and to be forced to just sit and think about things and in your life. Oh my gosh. I think that this period actually, on top of all the stress, actually did a lot of good in that way, because we were actually forced to just be still. And I feel like I got to know my son in a different way, because I'm always at work, he's always at school. We see each other at night for a couple hours, do homework and go to bed, you know. But to be forced to be in the house with my child all that time, we talked about different things, and just to, you know what's going on in the 6-year-old, 7-year-old mind. So I think that was really the biggest thing. I cut my hair, I dyed it, something that I've been wanting to do for 10 years. I did it. So I feel like I got a sense of another identity of who Brandy really became or is. I got to get in touch with her during the COVID season. And so my friends did the same thing, some of them. So I don't know, doctors, do you think was that normal? do I need a procedure?
We're getting free counseling right now, y'all. Like, were we supposed to do that?
I know.
But Randy, I think you bring up such a great point, because in our society, people are so used to going, always be on, always on a device, always doing this, always do that. And so when families, were forced to spend more time together, it's almost like, oh, you got to be forced to spend time together. But it's like, wait, it brought so many people, closer together, people who you normally wouldn't pick up the phone and talk to, now all of a sudden you're having conversations for hours. And we even saw how our world started healing, just, climate wise through the environment. And so I think it is interesting that you said, is that normal? Because we have gotten to such a place where when did it become abnormal to talk and engage with your family? So it's really interesting. And so when we look at healing from all that, ladies, where does healing start? So first, let's talk about why healing is important, and then how does that start? So we'll go with you first.
Well, kind of going back to, I forget who said it, but acknowledging that there's a problem first, is that, or acknowledging that you feel this way, because a lot of times people don't want to admit to or seek out help, but if they know they're not feeling like themselves, they know they're sad or angry or whatever, but they just don't feel comfortable admitting it, or like seeking professional help, or like don't know like the first step as far as like going, as far as addressing it. So that's the thing. And I think, and going back to the whole phenomenon of like us being forced to sit and kind of be with our thoughts and be with our feelings and things like that, and versus being on the go and like having all these distractions. And so when you sit down and you have that time and space to think about like, okay, I've been avoiding XYZ. I've been neglecting my family. I should have done this for myself. I'm not taking good care of myself. I'm not, it's about being brutally honest with yourself. And then you can, be honest moving forward and figure out what you need. Because as long as, I saw a quote that said, I could never heal because I kept pretending I wasn't hurt. Right. And kind of the same thing. Like if you don't admit to being scared, if you don't admit to being angry, if you don't admit to being stressed, you're not going to be able to de-stress. So that's like the first thing. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous 101. Like the first step is acknowledging the problem. Like what is the problem? And then you can go about. I mean, individual counseling is a great, resource. I mean, just even people don't feel comfortable always venting to their friends or family because they feel like there's like a judgmental part to it. And that's totally understandable. But another thing I always advocate for is just like self-care. Like if you're not exercising, drinking enough water, or getting enough sleep, like that right there can work wonders for you. If you like, sleep is probably the first thing to go when we're like stressed or working too much or just have a million things to do. We cut into our sleep. But that's like the basic self-care thing, is to just get enough sleep. And then, of course, like eat a more balanced diet and hydrate, because like once those things start to go, it's easy to feel depressed. It's easy to feel anxious and like foggy headed and things like that. So it's much more basic than people probably think of. They think it's like a huge, like I have to do some life-changing thing to feel better. Right. But no, it's more about taking care of yourself.
Well, and it's really interesting what you mentioned about the stigmas too, and I know Brandy and I both relate to this, because it's almost like, when you are so busy in one role. So let's say, you're busy in that single mom role and you get stressed or you get frustrated or you get whatever. I think people are so quick to be like, oh, she's not going to be able to handle that. She's going to break. She's going to do this. And then when people go on to excel and achieve, they're like, oh my gosh, that person is awesome. But they don't understand everything it took to get there. They don't understand the stress. They don't understand that sometimes you had nights where you just cried in the shower, and you had to pull yourself back together. I think it goes back to that natural resiliency that you and Cicely were talking about earlier. And so I always find that, so interesting, the different stages that people kind of go through that you don't even see, and that people have to admit to themselves, yeah, no, I'm not always well put together. I may look like it on the outside, but they always say it's like that iceberg effect. You see this phenomenal person up here, but under the surface, you have no idea, everything that individual deals with or goes through, and what their coping skills and mechanisms are, and then being able to talk to somebody. And I actually wanted to bring this up. I was at a conference before, and we were talking, there were individuals of all diversity, and they were saying that it's really difficult for African American community to be able to get counseling and seek out treatment, because it's almost like a cultural thing that, you don't, go share your problems, or you don't, cry, in public, or do certain things. And I know for men, there's kind of like a masculine stereotype, like, I'm not going to open up and tell you I have problems or whatever, so when you talk about those stigmas, so how do people begin to break those down to where people even want to get help? How do we get to step one?
Well, my experience has been that counseling is becoming much more in, so to speak. I think, especially when Barack and Michelle said that they had to go to couples counseling, I think I really saw a difference in people, African American people, kind of when it's more normalized by somebody like Barack and Michelle, then it's like, oh, if they need counseling, then I know I need counseling, and they're, so it's much less stigmatized, I think, now than it was before. And I think it really helps to, and people do this anyway, but if you seek out somebody who you feel like can relate to your issue, like as an African American, as any Asian American, Hispanic American, or whoever, it's really helpful to talk to someone who maybe looks like you, who are you can probably read up on their bio, whatever services they provide, and if they what they do kind of speaks to you, then then it'll be easier to kind of build that rapport and talk it out and process it out. And because when you're talking to someone who doesn't look like you, who can't relate to what you've experienced, who has no idea what you're talking about, when you talk about certain things or say it a certain way, then all those barriers being there is going to make it much more difficult. So that's where I would start, is to look for someone who's kind of can speak to you, whether it's what they look like or what they do, what they specialize in.
Yeah, that's some great advice. What about you, Cicely? How do you, when you're working with your clients or when you're working with community members, how do you recommend that people start healing? Where does that place look like?
I agree with Zoe about the self-care part. As a first step, you're acknowledging that there's an issue, and then you are really taking better care of you, because I think sometimes it's really hard to begin to take action steps when the internal voice is kind of keeping you stuck, if you will. So I think actually acknowledging that what I'm feeling is more than what I feel like I can cope with. I think, and then that happens a lot when you face the things that you've been able to push down because of all the distractions that have previously been around. So I think when you are taking better care of yourself and you realize, okay, I'm sleeping better, I'm eating better, I'm exercising, there's still this weight, there's still something that I need help with. It's at that point that, seeking out someone who you can talk to can be a much, I've had clients where thankfully there have been different resources to kind of be birthed out of this pandemic. There is a website called Therapy for Black Girls, or I may be mixing the wording up, but those sites like that have become much more valuable during this time, because for those of us who are parts of marginalized populations, seeking out or having easily accessible resources is super important. But I've had clients come in and if I say, hi, how are you? What brought you here? Tears immediately, like no words, just tears.
Yeah.
And that right there just shows the floodgates when you allow them to open, and sometimes it's something that Zoe said made me think of a meme that it said something like, order to heal, you must feel, and then you've got to deal. So, kind of words, there does need to be some direct kind of, let's talk about, let's deal with it. But a lot of times, once that begins to happen, you put voice to some of the things that may have been previous traumas. You begin to take away the power that those traumas have. You begin to do something called sensitizing yourself to them. And then they become maybe the memory doesn't go away. Maybe the event that was traumatizing is something that you may think about, but it no longer results in the same level of anxiety or panic and those kinds of things. So it really, the acknowledgement and then, freeing yourself of whatever weight there is to just make that initial step. Those are two of the most important things you can do. And especially during a time like what we're in now. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I agree with what you all said. I think exercise is so important. Sometimes I feel like people underestimate the value of just getting out, taking a walk and getting fresh air, and we all know the chemicals that releases, give us those, feel good, emotions and lift our spirits too, so I think that sometimes people definitely underestimate the value of exercise. And then just taking up a hobby. What are your thoughts on that? Doing something new. I actually started painting. I'm not any good at it, but I hang them up on the wall. I like it. But it's, it's a form of release. And I know some people write as a form. Some people, will dance and stuff like that. So maybe getting involved in a new hobby too. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I definitely agree with taking up a new hobby or with re-engaging with a hobby that you used to have. For me, it was
true.
As I got into a point in my life, I've always been an avid reader for as long as I can remember, but I got into a point in my life where I only read for professional gain. So reading for leisure, actually reading a novel felt like, oh my gosh, it opened up my life. It felt so different and new to know these characters that were fictional and to not think about my own life and my work and to just allow myself to enjoy a story, that somebody had created. So yeah, putting together puzzles, when I that's something that I said I would do for my family, just have a puzzle going where you walk by, you can take a few minutes and pieces into the puzzle, those kinds of things that may have kind of fallen off the radar in our busy get up and go, kind of schedule that we'd had before COVID. Now we've got time for those kinds of things. So
exactly. Yeah. And I think when you look at the optimistic side of the pandemic, that's definitely one of the good things that have come out of it is that people are engaging in more time together. So ladies, thank you so much. Do you all have any final thoughts? Zoe, do you have any final thoughts on the importance of healing from trauma as a place to start living your best life?
This is very cliche, but I would say no time like the present. Just, it feels like, like the pandemic's been going on forever, but then it's like the time's starting to run together and people are like, well, it'll be over soon. Like, just focus on today, get yourself up today, look for help today, reach out today, and you can start feeling better as soon as today, maybe even tomorrow.
Right, definitely. Cicely, what about you? Any final thoughts?
Definitely agree with what Zoe just said. And also I'd say, know that you're not alone,
Yes.
Yeah.
during this time. And the struggle may look different from one person to the other, but joining together, getting the support that you need is you'll never regret it. You will never regret reaching out and connecting with someone else for help. So
definitely.
Oh, I agree. And being kind, because you never know, when you just said everybody wears it differently, you may see somebody with the biggest smile and think their life is great. They have it all together, but you don't know what they're dealing with, when you don't
100%.
see them. So being kind too, as a start. Brandy, what about you on some final thoughts?
As far as mental health is concerned, I'd like to take it from a religious, spiritual standpoint for a lot of people who don't believe in mental health, because God's got it. As a Christian woman myself, God absolutely has it. However, God gave us all talents. Your talent is what your talent is, but somebody else's talent is counseling. He put us here to do his work, and part of his work is getting us right. So if I need to go to a counselor because I said, God, I got to give this to you, and he leads me to a counselor, a mental health therapist, that means God is taking care of it. So knowing that these career paths exist because we need help in every aspect of our lives, and so recognizing that it's not a sham or anything, and that it's so necessary, and it is okay to talk to someone. And therapy has changed my life, and I've never been ashamed to say that. So absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Well, ladies, thank you so much for all of the wisdom and the experience that you have shared and the expertise. We are so thankful for you to be on the show today. For more information on today's guest and today's topic, head over to armaniray.com. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us for Start Now, a podcast to educate, entertain, inform, and inspire. Like Zoe said, we're going to go back there. You have to start sometime and you have to start somewhere. So why not start now? Thank you all again. We look forward to you joining us next time. Be safe and well.